I made a video a few days ago called The Poetry of the Impersonal, and I just want to develop that into a slightly different direction. In that video I was referring to the quote by Richard Dawkins where he says that science is the poetry of reality, and how I try to adapt that for my purposes was to suggest that the reality he was talking about might be substituted by the concept of the impersonal. It's the world without us, the world as it pre-exists. It's the world that we're thrown into, the world that we're cast into, the physical world, the world that's described, that can be described without reference to human involvement, at least in its classical form. I know there's some fringe areas, particularly in quantum science, where that's perhaps not so easily determined, but in general, the reality that Dawkins is talking about is the reality of the impersonal physical world. Okay, so I want to just try and do a complementary take on that in relation to the personal, the poetry of the personal, and perhaps a bit about the sort of the poetry of the social. Because I think when you're talking about the personal, you can't really ignore the fact that we're social beings, and part of our understanding of what it is to be a person, and to talk personally, and to have personal opinions, and to have all this personality is at least partly, if not significantly, a product of the fact that we are also social beings. So when I'm talking about the poetry of the personal, I'm not talking about the isolated individual. I'm talking about the individual as it exists within social formations and within the history of a social species, really, the history of the cognitive and behavioural evolution of a species which exists socially, and in which the idea of the personal is always in the context of sociality. All right, well, long introduction. So, the poetry of the personal. See, I've got this far, I'm not quite sure what I'm going to say next. I guess what I'm interested there is, I should just qualify. When I'm talking about poetry, what I'm not talking about is poems that people write about persons, as opposed to poems that people write about the impersonal world of science. What I'm talking about there is poetry and poetics, as it's used by people like Bachelard in the Poetics of Space, or as it's used by people like Raymond Gibbs, who talks about the poetics of mind, or about that whole understanding of cognitive poetics, the whole understanding of poetics, which identifies ways of thinking and ways of expressing things, ways of structuring information, which rely on the same techniques that poets use when they write poetry. This is what I said in my previous video. Things like compression and metaphor, metonymy, synecdoche, irony, allegory, all those kind of anthropomorphism, all those figurative speech of all kinds. And as I said in that previous video about the impersonal, there are a set of poetic devices which we use to understand and communicate and express the structure of the impersonal world. And I think there are a very different set of figurative poetic languages that we use to talk about the personal world. Yeah, I'm going to try and think what those things are now. I mean, obviously it does contain entities, poetic entities, which don't exist in the scientific world, in the impersonal. Entities like a self, or like I, or like personal perspective, or like standpoint, or like narrative. A narrative is very different is invariably a kind of personal thing. There are no narratives in the impersonal world of science. There are causal chains, but that's not the same as a narrative. If I can just pull out that distinction a wee bit more, I think Arthur Eddington said, he's talking about causality and time, he said time's arrow only flows in one direction, from the causal chains only move in one direction, but in physics there's no particular need for that. There's no good reason for that. Time doesn't have a natural direction in the impersonal world of the physical sciences. It's just a dimension. But of course in narrative it absolutely does. So there's a different kind of poetics in this one example I'm talking about, to organise chains of events. In the poetics of the personal uses narrative, which is unidirectional. The poetics of the impersonal uses causality and causal chains, which are not unidirectional. They appear to be to us because we're narrative beings, but there's nothing in physics which propels time's arrow from the past to the future. As I say, they're just points on a continuum or in a dimension. Okay. Yeah, I should probably spin out more of that really, but I can't think of any other examples. I mean, the other example I would probably move to would be something like this discussion of the I, the self. When we talk about, express, think about persons, and particularly the person that we feel we are, we use this term I as a kind of centre of narrative gravity. I think that phrase comes from Damasio. Whereas, of course, science writings, the whole concept of science, the poetics of science, the poetics of the impersonal, doesn't contain the I. There is no self in science by definition. It has no, as I said at the top end, it has no contact with persons. There is no human involvement necessarily, and so the I is plucked out of science discourse, and quite self-consciously so. If you're writing a scientific paper, you use the passive voice. You don't say I and refer to yourself in it. You leave that out as a poetic device which mirrors the cognitively poetic, physically poetic procedures of science, which remove the person, the idea of the person, from the impersonal reality of science. And of course that's completely different in the idea of the personal. You would not leave yourself out in the personal narrative. It's a necessary component of the whole poetic structure. Okay, that's all I've got to say, I think. So there's two examples there of the different poetics in operation. The poetics of causality, which you find in the impersonal world of science, contrasts with the poetics of narrative, unidirectional, multi-stranded kind of thing that you'd find in the poetics of the personal, and the existence of the I in the poetics of the personal as a kind of centre of narrative gravity, as opposed to the conscious dismissing of the self, conscious dismissing of the I, the axis at the centre of the spinning world, that you would that is removed from the impersonal dialogues and impersonal discourses of science. Thanks very much.